All right, here we go. Hello, everyone. We're back for another Malazan discussion. I am joined here today by my good friend, Dr. AP Canavan. Hello, AP.
Hey Philip, how's it going?
Oh, it's going really well. I am happy to be here for this discussion on Stonewielder. This is the third book in the novels of the Malazan Empire by Ian C. Esslemont. So I am having a great time reading this series. I am just having a really delightful time. This is our, by the way, this is our non-spoiler discussion AP and I will be doing for this video. We will also be having a spoiler-filled discussion, and that will be appearing in a little while on AP's channel, A Critical Dragon. So be sure if you have read Stonewielder and you want to hear the really good, juicy, detailed stuff, be sure to check out that discussion on A Critical Dragon. And that will probably appear a couple days after this video. So
Well,
yeah.
and you know the reason why it appears a few days later is because one of the two of us is absolutely rubbish at video editing and trying to put the things together, and one of us is really good at it. I will let the viewers decide which one is which.
Oh no, I'm afraid we're both pretty much rubbish. All I do is I just put up the video with the frozen moments and everything as I'll just pass it off as comedy. So,
Now,
that's my
I
trick.
am convinced, I am convinced that some of those frozen moments didn't actually happen in our conversation. You've just figured out a way to freeze my image in the least flattering way possible.
Yep, yep, yep. Usually when you're in the middle of saying something, yeah. So, yeah. That's my little trick. But so we have some good stuff to talk about here, even in the non-spoilers video today, because boy, I really enjoyed this book. I'm having a blast, and I have to say that I think Ian Esslemont is maybe the best writer of atmosphere I have ever come across. I mean, he's just fantastic. The atmospherics in all the books so far have been just tremendous and compelling and just really great stuff. I mean, I feel like I'm sucked right into the story as soon as he begins describing it. And this was especially true, I thought, in Night of Knives. That was one of the things I just loved about Night of Knives. The first book in novels of the Malazan Empire was just a really great atmosphere. And then I thought Return of the Crimson Guard was a really great book for the action, especially large scale, epic action. And what I have here in my hands in Stonewielder is, I think, a really nice wedding of those two fantastic skills. To me, the atmosphere in here is just fantastic, and the action, and we're talking because Night of Knives had action too. Obviously, it was breathless, but it didn't have the epic, large. It's a more compact story. So what you have in Stonewielder, in my opinion, is a wonderful combination of the atmospheric skills that Esslemont has, and his ability to have just wonderful action, but on an epic scale, like you had in Return of the Crimson Guard, and just really nicely combining those things, all those elements, into one book. So I'm very impressed with this. What did you think, AP?
Well, it's amazing. One of the things that I really like is when we see authors publishing work, and we sort of like eh, Esselmont's first Night of Knives is a novella. It is an incredibly short novel or a novella, and that is a very different style and technique to a large epic tome with Return of the Crimson Guard, which um, was doing some very very different things. So it was hard to get a sense of the transition and the balance and everything that Esselmont was trying to do. And then I think with this one, Esselmont really hones in on what he wants the series to be like. That this synthesis, this wedding that you talked about, this synthesis of these different styles, this is the book where everything comes together to go definitively. This is how I want my series to be. Um, I I find Esselmont's evocation of the setting, the tone, to be absolutely fascinating. And it's
Yeah.
not that um, other Malazan novels don't have very distinctive settings, but
Mm-hmm.
there's something about how Esselmont evokes them,
Yeah.
that makes them so sharp, almost like HD in the background. And that is very difficult to do
Oh yeah.
with a lot of fantasy scapes, because you're trying to create the impression of an alien place, an alien culture in someone's mind. And uh, quite often authors use the iceberg method, the idea of a little tiny bit of description at the top and let the reader just imagine everything below.
Yep.
But I think part of the strength that Esslemont brings to this is because himself and Erikson had spent so long developing the world between themselves with other people that it really developed a proper sense of history and
Yep.
reality. So
Yep.
when he's writing about it, he's able to dig into that shared, developed experience, and it's a much more developed world. So it feels, when he's communicating it, it feels more authentic, it feels more real, because it's not just, oh, I thought up this really cool idea, I'm going to add that into my book. This is, no, I thought up a really cool idea. We kicked it around for a while. We knocked off the rough edges. One of the guys play tested it and went, that doesn't work. So we tweaked it. And now when I'm writing about it, when I'm using it, I can narrativize it, I can play around with it, but I have a much better three-dimensional sort of understanding of it. I know how it works. I know how it fits with the grand history that got played and developed and talked about and discussed. So I think that's a great strength of Esslemont, is he's able to evoke that sense of history, that sense of place, and to create that tone where you can feel the build up to battles, you can feel the claustrophobia in scenes that are closing in on you. You can feel the fear of the characters. You can feel the horror of situations. Again, I think Esslemont does horror, elements of horror, so well, and just weaves them seamlessly in, so they don't feel atonal. They don't feel discordant, that someone's just dropped a horror element into the middle of a fantasy novel. It's no, it is a fantasy novel, and when they get here, it becomes creepier and more horrific in the way that if we walked into a haunted house, that atmosphere sort of descends on us. That's present in this world. And I think that's an amazing strength to the writing.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, one of the creepiest moments in all of the Malazan books I've read is in this book. We'll talk about it in the spoiler discussion. But and everything you said is absolutely true about the scale of this and that sense of the grand history behind all of it. And at the same time, though, this is a very tightly woven book with all, you've got a handful of threads essentially that he weaves together really well, and that of course come together in the conflagration that is the ending of this thing. It's just tremendous. But I just felt like these individual threads were so well done this time, and that made this for me. Even though I enjoyed Return to the Crimson Guard immensely, this was a tighter story in a way, I felt like. So I really liked that a lot, and the epicness was just there. I mean, so far anyway, the most tremendous naval battle I've read in the entire Malazan universe is in Stonewielder. I mean, that was just, wow, that just knocked my socks off. And it doesn't end there. There's lots of great epic stuff in here. There's also, I think, in terms of atmosphere and setting, one of the most intriguing elements to me the first time I read the Malazan Book of the Fallen, where there were these allusions to this storm wall every once in a while, and I was very curious about this part of the Malazan world. And finally, now I'm like reading Stonewielder. This is the book where you finally understand what this thing is. The wall, the storm wall, and just how amazing this setting is. We'll talk about it in the spoiler one, but wow. I mean, this is just a tremendous, incredible setting that you won't find anywhere. There are walls. I mean, walls are a thing in fantasy. There's the wall in A Song of Ice and Fire, of course. And there's some icy cold associations with that wall, obviously. But walls, I'm interested in what Esslemont has done in this book with the wall as a theme, as a barrier, psychologically speaking, not just the physicality of the wall as a barrier, but the psychological aspects of it, the othering that is part of a wall, right? This is a big theme in here. And so I think it's something we can talk about a bit, but that is one way that we define foreignness, is what's outside of our territory, right? We put up a wall, and whatever's inside is us, whatever's outside is other, right? So, and it's interesting because I think the desire for a wall might say more about who we are than it does about the people we're trying to keep out in some respects. And this is wrapped up in the religion, which we need to talk about as well. But also the idea that the theme that Esslemont so skillfully and subtly, because he doesn't hit you over the head with this, but the idea that we might just discover that the people or the entities we're keeping outside the wall might not be what we thought. And furthermore, we might not be what we thought once we discover that the fragility of the walls that we put up. So I just thought this was just a really great thing in here. So I'm sure you picked up on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of boundaries and walls, the symbolism attached with that, we see explored in completely different ways in other works. I mean, you mentioned a Song of Ice and Fire and the
Yeah.
wall that's there.
Yeah.
In the real world, obviously, you know, the Great Wall of China, like there are historical precedents in our world for these grand structures.
Right.
Oh, excuse me.
No problem.
But of it, one of there are two sort of literary examples that came to mind that I think encapsulate part of what Esslemont was exploring here. And one is obviously the Frost poem, very, very famous, you know, that has the line, "Good fences make good neighbors." This exploration of what a boundary actually means, what it means in terms of this is mine and that is yours, and it's clearly delineated, but what it means in terms of separation and what it means in terms of keeping someone out or keeping someone in.
Yes.
And we see this in Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, where there is an entire planet that has no boundary walls on it. It's an entire planet, apart from where the space station, the launch pad is, has a small boundary wall around it. And because it's the only wall, and it's around this launch area,
right?
You go, is it keeping the launch area in? Is it keeping that in? Or is it keeping everyone else out? Because, of course, walls work in two directions.
Right, right.
And if there's one thing we know about the Malazan world, about both authors in their works, they are never content to say, this is the only way to look at something.
Right.
It's always, let's take these different positions for slightly different aspects of the world that are all going to explore and examine this, and then leave it up to the reader to come to their own conclusion. This is all the author trusting in the reader to engage with the text and to examine these things with an open mind and go, yeah, I don't have a preconceived notion. Let's see where this takes us. And we see that in Stonewielder. And we see it not just with the concept of the wall and this idea of boundaries and this idea of delineation of self from other, but we see it in the way that religion is treated in it, or sorry, religions are treated in this.
Yes.
Because in Return of the Crimson Guard, obviously there was a lot about how myths are born, how legends are born, where we see some of the actions that we know will become storied. We see the beginnings of that with things. We see it in the middle of things. We see it at the end of things when they've already become legends and we meet the people who were involved. We see this at different points in that myth-making or story-making process. And this does the same thing. This is a continuation of that investigation, because here it's not legend and myth. It's the religion, the belief that builds up around legend and myth, and the people involved, the entities involved, the actual facts at the heart of these beliefs that can take on a life of their own, that can drift from the core purpose. And it is not a didactic message. It is not belaboring anything to the reader. It is offering this up to the reader to say, let's look at it from these different perspectives. I'm not telling you what to think,
Right.
but here's a couple of different ways to think about it.
Right.
Away you go. You know, it's,
Yeah.
and I like that. I like that invitation to engage, to think, and not just be lectured to by a narrative.
Yeah, I agree entirely. When it comes to religion, it's obviously a very important part of identity for many, many people. I would say the vast majority of people, their religion is a very important part of their identity, and you see that certainly playing out in Stonewielder. But you also see religion as a source of liberation. It is a source of oppression, yes, in the narrative, but it is a source of liberation as well. And that's what you were saying about all sides of a certain thing. This is something we see very much in Stonewielder, where religion as a, yes, it's used as a tool to say we are right and you are wrong, and you're going to hit you over the head with this, but at the same time it is also a means by which people find a positive identity for themselves and assert their value. So it's a really interesting thing. You see all of that in here, and it's really well done.
Because, well, just on that point, because I think if you and I took about 5 seconds, we could probably run off the top of our heads a number of fantasy novels where the heroes are essentially secular or anti whatever gods, and the villains are an evil, corrupt religion. That it's a trope within fantasy. Now, and again, just because something is a trope does not necessarily make it bad.
Right.
But we know that both Esslemont and Erikson, the Malazan world, a lot of the Malazan world was designed to investigate, deconstruct, play with, invert, subvert tropes of the genre. Yeah. And I think we see part of that here in that, yeah, this one is looking at the aspect of fantasy religions. And I think both authors have always shown great sensitivity in their treatment of anything that touches directly onto a real world issue. And, it is something to appreciate that when authors, they want to talk about it, but they don't treat it flippantly. They don't treat it facetiously, and they treat it with an open mind, and they show the good, the bad, the ugly, and other mixed metaphors involving Westerns. So
sorry.
I do like it when I can make you laugh in the middle of one of these.
Oh dear, that was good. Yeah, so that's really well done in here, and I really appreciate that about this, that you do get all sides of it, and we see this in the real world as well. Obviously, religion historically, certainly, and even in the current day, is sometimes used as a weapon, and this is most unfortunate. It is in a way a kind of abuse of religion, in my opinion, when that happens. Exploitation of religion, often for ulterior motives. But yeah, it can also be used to build people up. So it's really good. Another part of, we talked about walls as barriers and keeping people out. There's a sort of a flip side to that occurs in Stonewielder as well, and that is occupation, and the idea that sort of an occupying power, a colonial power, and asserting itself as somehow different and therefore superior, but also finding itself becoming absorbed in some ways into the native population. And just, by the way, what is the native population? Because you might have somebody saying, oh, these occupiers, these foreigners, these evil, blah, blah, blah. And then you might have somebody standing next to them thinking, I seem to recall that you people were also the occupiers at some certain point or other, right? So there are these really nice layers of that. And that is another thing that is handled beautifully in here.
And one of the fascinating things about this, so obviously this is not a spoiler to say the name of where this is set. I don't think that that's going to spoil anything. But
It's got to be on the back.
well, okay. So, but we're talking about
Oh yeah.
that. And what does it say on the back? So I'm not spoiling things.
Oh, it talks about Corelry and the religious wars and the Malazan Empire invasion of Corel and all
So,
that is on the back. So we are good to go.
so one of the interesting things is Coralry is this setting, and we know from the beginning of Return of the Crimson Guard that that character that we were introduced to in the prologue, who was walking around and had met with Draconis and Lyosirical, was originally there.
Yeah.
And if humans are going to say we're the native inhabitants, that person wasn't human and they were there first.
Yeah.
So there is a fascinating breakdown of what it means in terms of who is native. How long does someone have to be there to
Yeah.
be native? What does it mean to be native?
Yes.
And this this is a very complex subject, and it's very emotive and can be very deeply personal to people, depending on which culture they're from and where they live.
Yeah.
But if we think across the span of human history, populations have migrated. And when a population settles somewhere long enough, that becomes then, oh, they were the population. And because of Esslemont's anthropological and archaeological background, he's he's not looking at this solely, oh, you only have to be there for 2 years and then you can count yourself a native. He's thinking in terms of aeons, that it in terms of the span of history,
Yeah.
10,000 years, 20,000 years, that we are looking at the entire period of Homo sapiens on this planet.
Wow.
That's what he's kind of playing with here.
Yeah.
And because of our short span on this earth, our mortal limitations, our limitation in considering times that big, that very much affects our perception of colonial, post-colonial, imperial, notions of national boundaries, notions of people, notions of tribe,
Yeah.
that these are deeply complex issues. And again, Esslemont doesn't dictate it is this one thing. It's here's a whole load of different facets about how we structure society, how society sees itself, how it sees others, different types of society, different ways that people band and group together. It's about the formation of communities and cultures. It's about the rejection of other communities and cultures, no matter if we call them nation states or countries or tribes or communities. It's about that general concept on the macro and micro scales.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting because we have a lifespan of, some nowadays 80 something years if we're lucky. And we tend to walk around with the feeling that I am the center of the universe and people like me are normal and all of that. And it's such a powerful thing when you have this breakthrough, when you have this is something I love in all of the Malazan books. And maybe it says something about me that I love this theme and I love the way both Erikson and Esslemont deal with it. But there are these moments of connection that happen because you have all of these different kinds of people and you have these layers of invasions and settlements and they do it so well. And it's just so convincing. But what I find fascinating is that moment of realization when the perspective suddenly changes and you're forced to realize, oh, from this person's perspective, I'm actually the invader. Or, you know what I mean? Or actually, I have way more in common with this person that I thought I detested than I'd like to admit. It's a really interesting thing that they do here. And they do it, again, I think in the best possible way, which is not shoving it in your face, but naturally leading you there to these moments through the story. So, and it's just beautiful. It's something that I love.
Yeah, well, I have 2 points to that. The first is to go back to your earlier point about, our idea that we all this egocentrism that we think we're the center of the universe. And I wanted to bring up astrophysicists have had real problems trying to pinpoint the exact center of the universe. And
Hmm.
I am absolutely convinced it's because I keep moving house. Um,
Okay.
but but my actual point about this is something that Esslemont has been very open with and is front and center in his narrative. If we think Knight of Knives, Kiska and Temper,
Yeah.
when they see each other, but we get it from both perspectives, and we see that it's entirely different. They do not see each other the way that they see themselves. In Return of the Crimson Guard, the Malazans, well, the Malazans and the Old Guard, and it gets broken out that, but for the Crimson Guard, they see the Malazans, and we see, two sides to a conflict, and then we go, well, are they so different? Every time we get points of view from the other, it's as if we were reading the Lord of the Rings, that instead of the Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli chapters and the Hobbit chapters, we also had the Orc chapters.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how different the Lord of the Rings would be as a text if interwoven into that was the perspective of certain orcs all the way through?
Yeah.
How that would change how you felt about the orcs, how you felt about them as enemies, as other, as monster.
Yeah.
Because if we got their point of view, even if we don't sympathize with them, even if we don't agree with them, we get a sense of empathy and understanding, because once we see the background of someone, once
Mhm.
we understand that, we start finding points of connection, and it is harder to then other them, to turn them into a monster, to deny them their humanity, when we actually understand these points of connection. And it's not, again, like, to go back to that point, it's not didactic. It's not
Yeah.
telling you have to do this. It's letting you experience it and decide for yourself. And that, I, obviously I like it because I like narratives that trust the reader. I like narratives where the author does not talk down to the reader.
Right.
And I like narratives that give me that room to negotiate, to construct my own meaning out of things without it having being spelled out to me and spoon fed to me and
Right.
forcing me into, this is how you should read this. That I'm given room to disagree, I'm given room to agree. And that's one of the things that make these books so enjoyable for me to read.
Yeah. Same here. Same here. I mean, it's just so much more effective to tell a story than to preach a sermon. And I think anyway, and that allows people to come to their own conclusions in ways. That's a good lesson for people who teach as well, I think. So
Well, but this from your teaching experience. You can
yeah,
get up and you can give a lecture to a class,
yep,
but if you get the class involved in a discussion,
yep,
if there's a backwards and forwards, if you posit multiple examples that are slightly different each time so that they can reconceptualize what you're talking about,
yep,
those students understand the subject better, they engage with it more, and they feel more valued. They're part of the process. They don't feel that you're just talking at them. They feel that you're discussing with them.
yeah, yeah. As a teacher, I've come to the conclusion that the best questions are far more important than the right answers. So that's how I feel, and that dialogue that you get into is where the magic happens. So yeah. So there are some other great things in here as well that we can touch on in a non-spoiler way. One of them being magic. Actually, we need to talk about that a little bit. But before that, I want, because this is a little bit more related to what we were talking about, the idea of friendship and trust is something that I think has been a theme before, but for some reason or other, I noticed it more prominently in Stonewielder. And we'll get into specifics later during the spoiler discussion, but the idea that you can reach a testing point, a near breaking point in an important relationship, in a friendship, is something that you see illustrated in this story beautifully. And the idea that has come up in other Malazan books of betrayal as well, as being a thing. And this is something that has occurred before Stonewielder. And I have a feeling this is going to be a big part of the novels of the Malazan Empire going forward, especially as you get more of the Crimson Guard. I'm guessing the Crimson Guard are going to become more and more prominent in the next 3 books. I'm taking a wild guess here based on what I've seen so far. But the idea of betrayal versus friendship, I guess, did you pick up on that?
But I think this is one of the things when we see these as a series in their own right, which I think a lot of people fail to do. There's a general conception of these books as being bolt-ons or add-ons or side novels, or these are a series in their own right, and points of connection between them, what Esslemont builds on each time. So if we think Return of the Crimson Guard, there was a lot about the relationships and betrayal. That's a big part of Return of the Crimson Guard. We see aspects of it in Knight of Knives. This is a theme that I think Esslemont continues to explore. And again, it's not betrayal bad, because remember, in Return of the Crimson Guard, we saw aspects of it that from one point of view, this is betrayal. But from the other point of view, it was someone standing up for what was right.
Yes.
And again, it's no, it is a flippant and facetious thing to say that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. But again, it goes to that point about othering and about division and about seeing someone on the other side of something, casting them in the worst possible light. Someone on your side, you cast in the best possible light. This polarization, this separation into tribal states. Where you have to be part of your tribe and support your tribe and have to hate the other tribe.
Right.
But I think part of what we see in Esslemont is an exploration of what that means when it is brought to extremes, when we see it at the individual level, the group level, the wider sort of tribal level, the nation state level, again, playing up and down through these micro and macro scales to investigate the concept from different angles and perspectives to see if this plays out, if it bears true, and to look at the ramifications of that. So it's a wonderful thematic point that runs through these books. And obviously, I'm not going to talk about the later ones because you haven't read them yet. You're a first-time reader of these.
That's right. But you can go back to Knight of Knives even, and was what Lasine did to Kellen Vet and Dancer. Was it betrayal, or was it something she had to do in the best interest of the Empire? You know, so it's like you say, it is woven throughout. So
and that idea of perspective, it's one of the things I love are these books. It's not just using multiple points of view for the sake of multiple points of view. Each of these POV characters serves a function and role above that of their place in the narrative and what's going on, but to give us a different perspective of certain themes, certain things that are developing. And when people approach this, as they have done with Erikson's work in Malazan Book of the Fallen, they go, I don't like this story thread because nothing happened. We have created somehow in this modern world an expectation that novels are just meant to be narrative events that we skip along the surface of for our enjoyment. Now, that is not to say that novels can't do that. There are lots of great novels that do that, but that is not the sole reason, the only reason, or the only function of literature and novels. We can see these other things being played out. And this, obviously, we see these multiple perspectives.
It's like you were saying in your video the other day about kernels and satellites. And for many people, it's all about the kernels. And that's what we've been taught more and more. I think we've been trying to whittling things down to the kernels, but if you do that, you're missing a lot, because a lot of the stuff that really sticks with me often is the satellite parts. It's where the thematic stuff gets developed, where the parts that really make me reflect and think and change me are often in the satellites. So
And this is I think people misunderstood when I was talking about narrative satellites, saying, like, oh, you can get rid of them and the narrative still functions. The
yeah, yeah,
narrative events still function.
right,
So, if you take out the Council of Elrond in the middle of the Fellowship of the Ring,
yeah,
the entire quest collapses because it doesn't make sense anymore. It skips the point that you actually need for the next piece to happen.
right,
But the satellites, it's not that the satellites are unimportant. It's that the narrative event depicted is not one that the entire weight of the narrative has to be supported by.
right, right,
But you can have brilliant battle sequences that are these action set pieces that are entirely a satellite, because nothing changes really from beginning to end, because it's a hero killing off nameless foot soldiers.
right,
And at the end, the hero is then standing there. Nothing has changed.
yeah,
But it can be a brilliant action set piece. We can have character set pieces. We can have character scenes. We can have scenes that really develop the world and or the tone. These things that the entire narrative construction, that the entire novel needs to function as a novel, can be satellites.
right,
But this specific narrative event may not be necessary. That's
yeah,
what I meant about that. And it's when we start thinking solely in terms of the narrative events and the progression of what people commonly call plot
right,
or story, this didn't serve the main story. That is one type of narrative,
right,
and you don't read that. There are so many other genres where the idea of having all of these plot driven elements would be antithetical to what the author is doing. And if you did that, everyone would complain about it being contrived and silly, and this isn't a proper slice of life because, oh, look how convenient these things were. There's always going to be a balance, but we have to remember fantasy is a broad genre. It is a deep genre,
yeah,
that there is room for all of these different things. If it is not your cup of tea, absolutely fine. Go and find a cup of coffee that you like. Find a different drink that you like. No
yep,
one is saying you have to like it,
yeah,
but to dismiss it because it doesn't fit your parameters of what you think a fantasy story should be
yeah.
is a self-imposed limitation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't want to give the impression that Stonewielder is lofty and full of themes. And it's actually a really action packed book, and it's got a big, it's got a great pace. But I don't want to use it as an example, though, of kernels versus satellites, because this is spoiler free. But so to use an example that's more familiar from my little world, Beowulf is a great, I think, illustration of, I think, what you mean, because if you just take the kernels, the narrative kernels of Beowulf, it's Beowulf kills Grendel. Spoilers for Beowulf. Beowulf kills Grendel. Beowulf kills Grendel's mother. Beowulf fights the dragon and kills it, but also dies. And that's it. Those are the narrative kernels. Is there more to it than that?
Well, you include in Herod when they go in and they get challenged, and it's you now have to go and kill Grendel. Like that would be a kernel, because that sets it up. You would have
okay, so Grendel eats a bunch of people then. Okay.
Yeah, Grendel eating a bunch of people to set up the thing that's going to happen. But yeah, essentially the specific narrative events are they are focal points. They pin down what the whole thing is going to be.
Yeah.
They are the scaffolding on which this grand epic rests.
Right.
But it's the drinking songs, it's the boasting, it's the development of the character, it's the conversations that they have, it's
and in the case of Old English poetry, because it is very much rooted in oral formulaic tradition, there are lots of what I call side stories where the poet will wander off and talk about some funeral, or we'll talk about, the poem begins and ends with a funeral, or we'll talk about some battle that happened 100 years before, or and just a lot, and it's thematically linked in the mind of the original audience and the bard, and it enriches the story so that it becomes something that is about, it's not really so much an epic as a lament for the past. it's about life's fleetingness. And you wouldn't have that if you just told the narrative kernels. So
And I think that, obviously Beowulf is a very curious example, because do we think Beowulf is an ancient Norse story that was transcribed by a Christian monk who then sort of Christianized it? Or was it they had heard a bunch of these sorts of stories and then tried to write their own sort of Christian version of a Norse story? Was it piecing together a couple of different stories and then a Christian monk wrote it and added their own interpretation because they were recording it in a non-oral way? So they, as they were scribing it, they did something different with it. We don't know the author of Beowulf, so there's a lot of ambiguity about what is going on with it. It's that ambiguity, that room to interpret it in different ways, I think makes it an even better text than one is just, no, this is what happened.
Yeah, that author is dead. So,
literary theory jokes. We know how to bring the audience in.
Oh,
look at that
do.
subscriber count plummet.
Oh well. So we better move on to back to Stonewielder.
Yeah. Action, things blowing up.
Yeah, tons.
Absolutely epic, large-scale battles, small-scale battles. Again, Esslemont delivers action in a visceral, brilliant, explosive. It's stunning, the set pieces in it, the action pieces in it. Like, and some of them are brutal and some of them are very poignant. Like, again, running the emotional gamut.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of explosions, the magic. I feel like Esslemont, if you really want to know how magic works in the Malazan world, you need to read Esslemont's books, because he explores facets of magic in here in ways that I have not seen before, and I really enjoy. So I think he is more interested perhaps in investigating how magic works than Erikson is. I don't know. You know better, because
I wouldn't say that. Erikson has a book coming out, The God Is Not Willing, and I think fans of the magic in Malazan are really going to like some scenes in The God Is Not Willing.
Oh, you tease me. Okay.
Well, yeah. But I will say, again, like, Esslemont has this wonderful exploration of the magic.
Yeah.
And it's not that Esslemont knows the magic better than Erikson. Okay. They both game this. They both understand it. Esslemont uses it in a different way. And I think he likes playing with what the nuances or the tricks are with the magic. Whereas I think Erikson, for a lot of it, was using magic more in a grander, symbolic, it was like power, and not necessarily as focused on it as a tool within the diegetic universe, a tool within the diegesis. He was looking at it more as part and parcel of what he was exploring thematically. But I think Esslemont delights in playing with what the magic can actually do. And there are some scenes in this that you just try to wrap your head around and go, I hadn't considered it from that perspective. And it's so much fun. It's a depth and a playfulness with the magic that I think is great.
Yeah. And speaking of playfulness and fun, the humor is absolutely fantastic in here. Yeah, but we're going to talk about them later again, but you have a couple characters in here that are just comedic brilliance. And of course you have the soldier humor and everything else as well wrapped in there. But I love this guy's sense of humor. It's a great part of it.
And I have to say, like, one of the great things, I think you're thinking of a particular dynamic duo.
Yeah.
And it's a very delicate thing when you have like these characters who are clearly comic relief. You see it in Shakespeare with the rude mechanicals and various characters brought in as a way to alleviate or give cathartic relief or a breather to the audience to get away from and process a very heavy scene. Yeah. But if you overuse it, it loses its efficacy. If you had lots of it, it wouldn't be as funny. what I like is there's a real nuance in the balance that Esslemont strikes, particularly with these characters.
Yeah.
You get just enough that you want more,
Yeah.
but never so much that you go, well, that was a bit too much, that went a bit too far. You he knows, he understands that whole thing about leaving you wanting more is the best way to leave you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He does that. Oh, there's one scene I'm dying to talk about, but we can't yet. But speaking, yeah, maybe we've said enough now for the non-spoiler discussion and giving people enough of a tease. And hopefully, if you haven't read Stonewielder yet and you haven't picked up novels of the Malazan Empire, we have piqued your interest a bit. And
But
yes,
one very last thing.
yeah,
Although I earlier described these as a sequence, a thematic sequence, you can read them as a series.
yeah,
You could theoretically read these as standalones because there's enough in each one that you could follow a standalone story, because a lot of it is implied history, a lot of it is a story in media res. And if a story is
yeah,
in media res, then it doesn't matter if you've seen a much earlier bit of it, because
yeah,
you're still jumping in the middle of a story anyway. The the difficulty of saying that to people is, don't expect it to be book one of a series that's going to explain everything to you.
right, right,
This works so much better if you've read the previous ones.
yeah,
But
yeah,
theoretically, it is a self-contained narrative. It functions as a narrative on its own. It functions as a book, a standalone on its own,
yeah.
for the most part.
See, I would have said that about Knight of Knives. I would have said you could read Knight of Knives purely as a standalone, whereas I hear what you're saying, and I think you're probably right. But I came away feeling like this is really a sequel to Return of the Crimson Guard,
Yeah.
and I'm expecting whatever's next. Is it a Blood and Bone? No, Blood and Bone, or is that what's next? I can't remember. What is that
Blood
right
and
after
Bone,
Stone?
Blood and Bone, Orb Scepter, Throne, and then a Sail.
Sale. Okay, got it. So whatever's next, I expect to be certainly some threads continuing in the next book. I hope so. So, but yeah. So all right. Well, we will continue our discussion over at A Critical Dragon, where we're going to talk some really nice spoilers, get into some specifics, and have a whole lot of fun. Thank you so much, AP, for this. It is the highlight of my month when I get to talk to you. So I really appreciate you being here.
And thank you so much. Talking about these books with someone that you can bounce ideas off, who doesn't always agree with me, and
Yeah.
that is nice. I don't expect everyone to agree with me, but it's really nice chatting with you about this, because I get challenged in what I think. I learn from your perspective, and that is always valuable, and it is always enjoyable. So thank you very much, Philip, and thank you for, allowing me in to annoy your audience.
I think they appreciate it very much. I certainly do. So thank you so much. And we will see you over at A Critical Dragon. I think I stopped.
No, you're still recording.
Oh, I hit stop.